Land inequality has historically caused inequality and brought great pain to South Africa. Land often means more than its economic value. There are some things that economics cannot measure. Economics can't quantify sentimental value or assign a number to collective trauma. This video essay seeks to answer the question, to what extent has the inequality of land ownership in South Africa caused broader inequality in income and wealth? We will also examine the policy implications of this. The analysis in this video essay will rely heavily on the following economic theory and concepts: Gini coefficients as a measure of inequality, theory of the firm, focusing on long-run cost structures, and lastly, how gains from exchange are allocated based on institutions and bargaining power. There are two burdens of proof for answering our question. We must prove a correlation between land ownership inequality, wealth inequality, and inequality in income. Secondly, we must establish whether or not this is a causal relationship. Of farms owned by private individuals, white South Africans own 72%. This leaves black South Africans owning 28% of farms. Now let's measure wealth by race. We can break down wealth into assets and liabilities. In terms of assets, Stats South Africa measures asset ownership using an asset score. It is based off a list of standard household assets. The more of the assets on the list that you own, the higher your score. In 2015, whites had an asset score of 14.7. The average score for the entire country was 9.8. You can see a detailed breakdown in Table 1. We see that whites own more assets than the average South African by far. We therefore see that both South African land and wealth follow similar patterns of ownership. This hints that the inequalities of the two are correlated. These inequalities are confirmed by examining the land and income Gini coefficients of South Africa. The Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality ranging from 0 to 1. A score of 0 shows perfect equality. A score of 1 would only be possible if one person owned everything. The higher the Gini coefficient, the worse the inequality. South Africa's Gini coefficient of land ownership has remained relatively unaltered since the 1960s. Our land Gini coefficient is 0.7. Our income Gini, as of 2015, was 0.65. Our wealth Gini is 0.763. Note that the most recent measure was found in 2000, but the general trends are unlikely to have shifted since then. Using my own calculations, we can see that these measures of inequality are incredibly similar. We have established correlation. Now we must examine causation. I contend that land inequality has caused broader inequality in South Africa to differing degrees at different points in history. I'll use economic theory to describe two ways that land inequality causes broader inequality. The first mode is how land inequality influenced broader inequality in the past. This was a matter of direct causation, and it had a considerable influence on broader inequality. I contrast this with the second mode, the mode of the present. Land inequality in the democratic South Africa is no longer the driving force behind increasing broader inequality. Instead, inequality influences the real cause of broad inequality, the labour market. In the past, agriculture was a significant contributor to GDP. It has since declined. It therefore figures that inequality trends in agriculture would more directly influence broader inequality trends in the past. There was simply more wealth tied up in agriculture. So we know why inequality of land ownership was more important in the past. So how did this inequality come about? We will answer this by focusing on the economics of the 1913 Natives Land Act as an economic shock because it was sudden, widespread, and modern enough for us to apply conventional economic principles with a degree of safety. The Act created reserves for black Africans, and they were only allowed to own land within these reserves. The Act also forbade the buying, renting, and sharecropping of land in white areas by someone who was not white. It restricted black Africans to wage labour on white land. 86% of the country's land was set aside for white farming. The rest was partitioned into reserves. The Act, and others like it, influenced inequality in two ways. Firstly, it facilitated a direct transfer of wealth from the many to the few. Secondly, it reduced the ability of the majority of South Africans to earn income, thus promoting further inequality. The first way of increasing inequality is rather obvious. At the time of the Act, agriculture accounted for roughly 19% of GDP. The Act drastically changed the ownership of what was essentially South Africa's most important economic asset. It was a direct transfer of wealth. The economic importance of land at the time meant that increasing land inequality would automatically increase wealth inequality. We can illustrate this transfer using a Lorenz curve. Now we move on to the second way the Land Act increased inequality in the past. The Act reduced many South Africans' ability to earn income. This is because the Land Act altered institutions and endowments. Institutions are rules that govern economic interactions. The Act changed institutions by forcing black Africans to either farm on reservations or work as wage labourers. The Act changed endowments by removing wealth in terms of land without compensation. Both of these alterations have drastic impacts on inequality, as shown by the core project diagram for the causes of inequality. The change of institutions promoted inequality by altering the agricultural labour market and competitiveness of black farms. The Act, by banning other forms of agriculture on white land, increased the labour supply. Using supply and demand, we can illustrate this impact. The increase in black Africans now looking to be wage labourers on farms shifted out the supply curve of labour. Demand does not change. This results in a new equilibrium price where labour price is lower. This change of institutions decreased the income of many black households. The institutional change impacted the competitiveness of black African-owned farms. The crowding of black African agriculture into reserves resulted in the degradation of land in these areas. Cost structures made this competitive gap worse. South Africa's staple crop, maize, has considerable economies of scale. Research into corn production in the United States shows this. The Act, in an economic instant, drastically increased the size of white farms while reducing the size of black farms. This triggered instant scale advantages. This sudden increase in farm size gave white farms a competitive advantage, increasing their economic profits over black farmers, thereby increasing inequality. Due to the cost structure of agriculture, this consolidation process would happen anyway. However, the Land Act and other state actions sped up this process and did it without compensation. This lack of compensation left black African farmers with much lower endowments. We have explored the theory explaining why land inequality may have directly caused inequality in the past. We must now explore the theory that shows land inequality is only indirectly causing income and wealth inequality now. We can no longer say that land inequality is directly causing broad inequality. This is because agriculture is only a small part of our GDP, at around 2.9%, and farmland is not a major asset in the portfolios of South Africans. Agricultural land only makes up under 6% of assets owned. This means that other assets have a greater impact on inequality. Land inequality indirectly causes inequality by influencing the labour market. We refer again to the cost structures of large-scale agriculture that we find in South Africa. According to the previously mentioned research into United States corn markets, larger farms automate more easily when they're farming with our staple crop, maize. This means that they rely less on labour. This is evidenced in South Africa, where farm employment has fallen 25% from 1979 to 2010. The cost structures of large farms reduces demand for labour. This leaves farm labourers with few favourable options. They can accept a lower wage, or they can seek non-agricultural work. In 2013, 91% of South African farm labourers had not completed high school. This means that they have low human capital endowments and will struggle to find meaningful employment in the cities. This increases income inequality. We therefore see that inequality of land ownership indirectly increases income and wealth inequality. Land inequality is a historic cause and current inflator of broader societal inequality. I propose two policy options: land redistribution or an increase in human capital by investing in education. Both require ample resources from government to work. Human capital requires investing in education. Land redistribution requires government support to be successful. 90% of farms that have been redistributed in South Africa have failed because less than 20% of them received further state support. The cost structures of South African agriculture will hinder land redistribution. The economies of scale incentivize the existence of a few large farms rather than many small ones. If we redistribute and break up the farms, we will reduce output efficiency and eventually return to an equilibrium of a few large farms, as unsuccessful ones are bought up. Agriculture comprises only a small part of GDP. Redistribution would come at massive costs, as explained earlier, and these costs are not justifiable when redistributing such a small part of the economy. Investing in human capital, however, addresses how land inequality is presently causing inequality. It allows farm workers pushed out of agriculture to gain employment in the rest of the economy. Having explored the economics of land inequality and policy options, redistribution appears unwise. However, I must concede that other factors are at stake. Aside from the economic perspective, land inequality carries heavy historical, cultural, sociological, and political implications. the debate remains complex. Thomas Carlyle described economics as the dismal science. In this case, that appears to be true.